The drawer had been locked for 11 years. It sat in the corner of the bedroom, the bottom drawer of an old oak dresser Renee had moved 3 times since the funeral, and not once had she touched it. Not when she was packing up the apartment in Cleveland. Not when she hauled everything into the 2-bedroom in Cincinnati that smelled like someone else's cooking. Not when she finally, 6 years ago, settled into the small brick rental on Maple Cross, where she had been ever since. The dresser shoved into the same corner, the same drawer sitting there quiet and sealed, like a word she was not allowed to say. Marcus had been specific about it. He had not been a man given to unexplained rules in life. He had been practical, warm, a little cautious in the way that men who grew up with nothing often are, men who learned early that the world would not catch you if you stumbled. So you did not stumble. He had asked Renee only 3 things in their 9 years of marriage. Don't answer the phone after 9 at night if she didn't recognize the number. Don't co-sign anything for her sister Gwen. And don't open the bottom drawer of the oak dresser. He had never said why. He had said it the way he said most things that mattered to him, quietly, with a directness that left no room for negotiation, but also no room for fear, because the way Marcus said a thing was always the same, whether it was serious or small. Renee had nodded. She had understood that the explanation was not part of what he was offering. She had kept her word. Marcus died of a heart attack on a Tuesday in February. He was 41 years old. He left her with 2 daughters, a 10-year-old named Cora and a 7-year-old named Bet, a mortgage on a house they had already sold, $1,100 in a joint checking account, and that locked drawer. She had kept her word because it was all she had left of him. That kind of faithfulness is its own form of love, quiet and sustained, asking nothing back. Renee was 44 now. She worked the early shift at a grocery distribution center on the east side of Cincinnati, sorting orders from 4 in the morning until noon, 5 days a week. The work was physical and repetitive, and she was good at it. Good in the way you get good at anything you do for years with your full attention. Her hands were fast. She knew every section of the warehouse by feel, could navigate the rows in the dark if she had to, which sometimes in the winter months she nearly did, arriving before the facility lights had fully warmed. She wore the same work boots for 3 years. She brought her lunch in a container she washed out and refilled. She kept a small notebook in her bag with the month's numbers laid out column by column, not because she did not know the numbers by heart, but because writing them down made them real in a way that thinking about them did not, and real things could be worked with. The pay was just under $17 an hour. After taxes, after the girls' school fees, after the gas and the electric and the phone plan she shared with her mother, she had, on a good month, $220 left over. Most months, it was less. The refrigerator was making a noise it had no right to make, a low grinding that started around 2 in the morning and stopped on its own, and she had been putting off the call to the landlord for 3 weeks because the last time she called about something, he had mentioned raising the rent, and she was not ready to have that conversation. Cora was 21 now and gone, enrolled in a nursing program in Columbus that Renee had helped pay for 1 semester at a time, sometimes deferring her own dental appointments to make the number work, never mentioning this to Cora. Bet was 18 and a senior in high school, the kind of quiet, observant girl who noticed things without announcing that she had noticed them. Bet was the one who found the envelope. She had not been snooping. Renee needed that understood later, even though there was nothing to understand and no one to apologize to. Bet had been looking for a winter coat, Renee's old grey one with the broken zipper that she had worn for 6 winters, and that Bet had decided she wanted for a trip to a friend's house. And she knew it was somewhere in the bedroom, probably folded on a shelf or at the back of the closet, and she had checked those places and not found it, and so she had tried the dresser. She opened the bottom drawer first by mistake, pulling the wrong handle. The drawer slid open easily, which was the first thing that caught her attention because she had always assumed it was locked tight and she had never thought to test it. She looked in. The drawer was not locked. It had not been locked for some time, was her first thought, or perhaps the lock had given, or perhaps she was misremembering, or perhaps she had always assumed without trying, the way you assume about a lot of things you're never quite ready to find out. The key was taped to the inside of a plain white envelope, sealed, sitting alone in the bottom of the drawer. The envelope had a single word on the front in handwriting that Bet recognized even though she had not seen much of it in her life, having been 7 when her father died. She had seen it on birthday cards and a note or two that her mother kept in a small wooden box. She brought it to Renee in the kitchen. Renee was standing at the stove, and She heard Bet's footsteps and turned around, and she saw the envelope before she saw her daughter's face, and she knew the handwriting from 3 feet away. She sat down at the kitchen table without meaning to. The key was small and brass, with a round head, the kind that opened a safety deposit box or a small lockbox, not a door. It was not much to look at. Renee held it in her palm and felt the weight of it, which was almost no weight at all, and yet she sat with it in her hand for what felt like a long time. Her daughter across from her, the envelope open on the table between them, and the kitchen holding the sound of the refrigerator doing its thing in the corner. Bet did not ask questions. She did not suggest anything or interpret anything. She sat across the table and let the moment be what it was, which was the wisest thing the girl had ever done. Renee carried the key to the bedroom. She stood in front of the dresser and looked at the bottom drawer, which she could now see was not locked in the ordinary sense but had been pushed shut firmly, held by its own weight and by 11 years of no one opening it. The keyhole was small and round, and she had noticed it so many times, all those times she made the bed and straightened the room and cleaned around the dresser, that it had long since stopped reading as a keyhole at all and had become simply part of the furniture. She put the key in. The drawer opened. Inside were 2 things: a faded yellow envelope, thick and sealed, and a single photograph. The photograph was of Marcus at a place she did not recognize. He was younger in it, mid-20s, before the lines had settled into his forehead and before his beard had begun its slow advance toward grey. He was smiling the way she remembered him smiling before the worries of adult life had quietly edited the expression into something more measured. He was standing outside a building, a 4-story building of dark red brick with tall windows. On the building behind him was a sign she could not read clearly in the photograph, and below the sign, just barely visible at the edge of the image, was a street name in green and white. She tilted the photograph toward the bedroom lamp. Belmont Avenue, and below the street name, smaller, the name of a city. Pittsburgh. Marcus had never mentioned Pittsburgh to her. Not once in 9 years of marriage. Not in all the years she had known him before that. Not in the long, slow conversations of early courtship or the matter-of-fact exchanges of a shared life. He was from Cleveland. His family was from Cleveland. His grandmother had died in Cleveland and was buried in a churchyard he had visited every year until the drive became too far. He had told her his whole life in the patient way that people tell their lives when they feel safe enough to let someone in, and Pittsburgh had never appeared in that story. She opened the yellow envelope. Inside was a folded letter and a second, smaller envelope that had already been opened. She unfolded the letter first. It was from a law firm in Pittsburgh, dated 17 years ago, 2 years before Marcus died, which meant Marcus had been alive when it arrived, which meant he had read it. The letter was addressed to Marcus by full name, and it stated, in the careful formal language of legal correspondence, that a man named Samuel Odom had died intestate with no surviving relatives other than one named Heir, and that heir was Marcus. It said Marcus was the sole beneficiary of a property on Belmont Avenue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It described the property as a 4-story mixed-use building with 1 ground-floor commercial unit and 3 residential apartments above. It said a property management firm had been retained to maintain the estate pending contact from the heir. The attorney's name was Everett Gaines, and the letter gave a phone number and said that Marcus had 14 days from the date of the letter to respond. He had not responded. Renee lowered the letter and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall. The second envelope, the smaller one that had already been opened, was addressed to Samuel Odom. The return address was Marcus's, the Cleveland apartment they had lived in at the time. She slid the letter out and unfolded it. It was a single page, handwritten in Marcus's careful small script, dated 4 months before the attorney's letter, which meant Marcus had reached out first, which meant Marcus had known about Samuel Odom before Samuel Odom died. My name is Marcus Duval, and I believe I may be your son. She read it 3 more times. The rest of the letter was short. He explained that he had found a name through his grandmother's old papers after the grandmother died, and that the name had led him, slowly and over years, to a man in Pittsburgh. He wrote that he was not seeking money or recognition. He wrote that he had a wife and 2 daughters and a life he was grateful for. He wrote that he had 1 question, just 1, and that it was not a demand and carried no conditions. Are you my father? He wrote that he would not write again and would understand completely if the letter went unanswered. He had put his phone number at the bottom. Samuel Odom had not called. He had died instead and left everything he owned to the son who had written to him, and the attorney had sent the letter, and Marcus had read it and locked it in a drawer and died 2 years later without saying a word. Renee sat there for a long time. She thought about all the things Marcus had never said. Not from dishonesty, she understood that with a certainty she could not have explained. Not from any intention to withhold, but from the particular silence of a man who believed that unfinished things should not be handed to people who loved him. Because what was the use of worrying someone with a question that had no answer yet? She had watched him do it with smaller things. The job he had applied for and never mentioned until he had heard back. The car trouble he handled, and said nothing about until it was resolved, the worry lines he carried on his forehead that smoothed out once he had worked through whatever he was working through. He was the kind of man who absorbed the uncertain things, so the people around him did not have to live inside that uncertainty. He had absorbed the biggest uncertain thing of his life and locked it in a drawer and died before he could unlock it. She thought about what it cost him. To write a letter that began with a sentence like that, to put a phone number at the bottom and then wait, to check the phone and not see the call come in, to wait some more, to eventually understand that the answer was not coming, and then to receive, 4 months later, a letter from an attorney saying the man had died. She thought about Marcus reading that attorney's letter, alone, probably at the kitchen table in the Cleveland apartment while she was at work or putting the girls to bed, reading the words sole beneficiary and 4-story building and trust account, and sitting with the improbable, enormous fact of them. He had not told her, and she understood why, because the thing was not resolved. The thing was complicated, and grief-adjacent and unprocessable, in the way that finding your father's inheritance 2 years after your father died before you could meet him is always going to be unprocessable. And Marcus was not a man who brought people into the room of his unprocessed things. He was working on it. He had the key. He was going to figure it out. He had not had time. Renee folded the letter back along its original creases and set it on her lap. The room was quiet. Outside the window a car passed and its headlights swept across the ceiling and were gone. She was not a woman given to dramatic feeling on the surface, not because she didn't have it, but because feeling on the surface was something she had learned to ration, the same way she rationed the $220 because there was only so much to go around, and the practical business of living required most of what she had. She felt it now, though, in the space where all the practical business temporarily stopped. She felt something enormous and specific moving through her, not grief exactly, not anger, not wonder alone, but a combination she did not have a name for. She thought about it, and what she thought was this: he found his father. He found his father, and his father died before they could do whatever it was that letter was reaching for. And then Marcus died, and he locked the drawer because some things are too unfinished and too tender to hand to someone else before you understand them yourself. She looked at the photograph in her other hand. Marcus outside the building on Belmont Avenue. He had driven to Pittsburgh. He had stood on the sidewalk in front of a building that was, at that point, still owned by a man who might or might not be his father, and someone had taken his picture. He had been holding a hope that had no guarantee attached to it, and the photograph had caught him in the middle of that hope, and he was smiling. Bet was standing in the doorway. She had followed quietly and stood there watching her mother sit on the floor beside the dresser, and she had not interrupted, which was, Renee would tell her later, the right call. "Mama," she said. "What is it?" Renee looked up and let herself take a breath. "Your father had a father," she said, "and that man left him a building, and your father didn't have time to figure out what to do about it." Bet looked at the photograph, then at her mother. "What are we going to do about it?" If you have ever held something like that in your hands, something unresolved and precious left behind by someone you loved, then you know what the question is. What now? Leave a comment and tell us. And stay with this story because what came next changed everything. Renee called the number on the attorney's letter the next morning. Everett Gaines had retired 5 years earlier, but the firm still operated under the same name, and the receptionist who answered listened carefully and put her on hold, and came back and said she was being transferred to one of the senior partners. The partner's name was Holloway, a woman with a brisk voice that softened when Renee finished explaining. "Mrs. Duval," she said, "we have been hoping someone would call." The estate had been held in administrative suspension for 11 years, which was unusual but legal under Pennsylvania law, because the heir had never responded, and there were no other claimants. The property management firm had continued operating under the existing authority. The rents had been collected. The maintenance had been performed. The net proceeds, after expenses, had accumulated in a trust account administered by the firm. All of it was documented, all of it was intact, and all of it was contingent on someone with standing making contact. Standing, in this case, meant proving that Renee was Marcus's wife, that Marcus had been identified as Samuel Odom's heir, and that Marcus had since died, making Renee, as his surviving spouse, the heir to his estate. It would require a probate process in Pennsylvania. It would require documents, the birth certificate Marcus had never told her the significance of, their marriage certificate, his death certificate, her own identification, a notarized statement. It would require a probate attorney in Pennsylvania, which meant a fee she did not have yet. She called her mother that evening. Her mother called Gwen. Gwen arrived on Saturday morning in a car that was not reliable but was available, which was the relevant fact. Renee sat in the passenger seat with a folder of documents on her lap and a coffee she had made at home because Highway Rest Stop coffee was $4 she wanted to keep. The hills of western Pennsylvania came up through the windshield in long, rolling waves, bare and brown in the early spring cold, and Renee watched them and thought about Marcus on this same road 17 years ago, alone, not knowing yet what he was driving toward. The sun was behind the clouds the whole way, and the light was flat and grey, and when they came down into the river valley and the city rose up on the other side, she felt something she did not expect, which was recognition. As if she had been here before in some form, as if the city had been waiting for her just long enough to become patient about it. She found the building the way you find something you have only seen in a photograph, by the shape of it, the specific proportion of the windows and the colour of the brick and the line of the cornice against the sky. She knew it before she knew the street name. She pulled the photograph out of her folder and held it up against the windshield, lining it up. The building was the same. Of course it was the same. Gwen parked and did not say anything for once, which was a mercy. Renee stood on the sidewalk across from the building for a long time. Bette stood beside her. The print shop sign in the ground floor window was visible from across the street, hand-lettered, neat. There were curtains in the upper windows, evidence of people living ordinary lives behind them. People who paid rent into a trust account held by an attorney and had no idea whose name was on the title. She thought about Marcus in this same spot. She thought about what it is to stand in front of something that is yours by blood and not know it yet. She thought about the particular kind of longing that looks like hope and the particular kind of courage that looks like an ordinary man taking an ordinary drive on an ordinary Saturday. She crossed the street. She pushed open the door of the print shop and a bell rang above her head. The owner was named Pearl, a small woman in her 50s with ink on her fingers and reading glasses perched at the end of her nose. She looked up when Renee came in, and then past Renee, at Bette and Gwen, and then back at Renee with the unhurried assessment of a woman who had been in business long enough to read people accurately in about 30 seconds. "Can I help you?" she said. "I own this building," Renee said. It was the first time she had said it out loud, and she was not prepared for how it felt. It felt like a sentence with too much weight for its words. "Or I'm in the process of establishing that I do. I'm sorry to come in without calling ahead. I just wanted to see it." Pearl set down her scissors. "The building has been in a state," she said carefully. "It has. My husband was the heir. He passed 11 years ago, and I've only just found out about it." Pearl looked at her for a long moment. "Then you've had a difficult few days," she said, which was not what Renee expected, and was exactly right. The probate process took 7 months. 7 months of certified mail between Cincinnati and Pittsburgh, of forms she had to fill out twice because she made a small error on the notarization the first time, of a probate attorney in Pittsburgh named Wendell, whose fees she paid in 3 installments, the first from money she borrowed from her mother, the second from Cora, who had started working part-time at the hospital where she did her nursing clinicals, and who wired her $300 without being asked, which made Renee cry alone in the car for 10 minutes before composing herself and driving to the pharmacy. The third installment she managed from a tax refund that arrived in March, smaller than expected, but sufficient if she was careful. She was always careful. There was a court date in Pittsburgh in October, a Tuesday morning, and she drove up alone at 4:30, arriving before the clerk's office opened, sitting in the courthouse parking garage in the dark with her folder of documents and a thermos of coffee and the quiet that early morning waiting carries, which is not peaceful exactly, but has a kind of clarity to it. She had brought the photograph. She was not sure why. The judge was a methodical woman in her 60s who asked her questions in a clear, measured voice and seemed to require only honest answers, which Renee had. She answered each question as plainly as she could. She did not editorialize. She did not narrate the 11 years, or explain what it had felt like to find the envelope, or describe the way Marcus's handwriting still landed in her chest, like a hand pressed there. The judge signed the order. Renee did not cry in the courtroom. She waited until she was in the parking garage, engine off, and she allowed herself 2 minutes because that was the amount she had decided on, and she was a woman who kept to her decisions. Then she wiped her face, started the car, and drove home. The building on Belmont Avenue became hers on a Wednesday in November. The trust account held, after 11 years of collected rents and paid expenses, a balance of $214,000. She wrote the number on a piece of paper and put it on the kitchen table and moved around it for 3 days, the way she had moved around the dresser for 11 years, not avoiding it, just giving it room. Just letting herself arrive at it, slowly enough that when she finally looked at it directly, she was sure she was ready. On the third morning, she called the distribution centre and gave her notice. She was standing by the loading dock in the early cold when she called, watching her breath. She gave 2 weeks because that was right. Her supervisor said he was sorry to lose her. She thanked him and meant it. She did not leave because the number on the paper was a fortune, though to her it was, though to anyone who had ever budgeted $220 a month against a life's actual costs it was. She left because the building required attention of a kind you cannot give from a phone between shifts, and because some things need to be shown up for in person, and she had learned that from Marcus too. The apartments needed inspection. The ground floor lease needed reviewing. The cornice at the roofline was showing the first signs of mortar loss that Roy had flagged in his maintenance log. And Roy himself was a man she needed to know in person before she could understand what she had. Roy met her on Belmont Avenue on a Thursday morning in March. He was in his 60s, broad-shouldered, with a grey beard and the deliberate movements of a man who had been doing careful physical work for a long time. He shook her hand with both of his. "I've been maintaining this building for 11 years, he said, "and nobody ever came to see it." "I know," she said. "I'm sorry it took so long." He looked at her for a moment as if calculating something. Then he nodded and turned to the door. He walked her through the building from the basement to the roof, pointing out what was solid and what was not with equal frankness, holding doors, clicking on lights, explaining as he went in, the shorthand of someone accustomed to translating physical things into the language of cost and time. The foundation was good, poured concrete, no movement, nothing to worry about for 20 years. The plumbing was serviceable but old. The kind of old that did not require immediate action but rewarded attention. And Roy had a plumber he trusted, who could survey it and give her an honest assessment. The boiler was 18 years old, a commercial unit of the sort that was built to last but not forever, and he had given it 2 winters at the outside before she would need to make a decision about replacement. The second-floor apartment's sticking window he showed her himself, demonstrating the resistance in the sash, the way the wood had swollen from a winter of moisture working into the frame. A half-day job for someone who knew what they were doing. He had been meaning to see to it since November and had not, because there was a question of authority when the estate had no active owner. Now there was no question. The third-floor tenant, a man who had lived there 4 years, was quiet and paid early. The woman on the first residential floor worked nights and kept the common hallway cleaner than Roy kept it himself. "She asked me once who owned the building," Roy said, meaning Pearl. "I didn't have a good answer." "You do now," Renee said. She went back down to the print shop and stood at the counter. Pearl looked up from her work with the same measuring look she had given Renee 6 months ago, except this time there was something warmer behind it. "The court approved it," Renee said. Pearl nodded. "Are you changing my lease?" "No," she said. "I'm not raising the rent either, at least not now, not until I understand things better." Pearl took off her reading glasses and set them on the cutting table, and looked at Renee with an expression Renee could not quite name, somewhere between relief and something older than relief, the way people look when they have been waiting for a resolution for a long time, and it finally comes in a form they could not have predicted. She came around from behind the counter and extended her hand, not the quick professional handshake of a tenant meeting a landlord, but something more deliberate than that. "Your husband," she said. "Roy told me once that the man who originally left the building had a son somewhere, and that the son had passed too. I'm sorry." "He found this place," Renee said. "Right near the end, he drove up here and stood outside, and I think he went in. I think he saw what it was. He just didn't have time to do anything about it." Pearl nodded, still holding her hand. "Well," she said, "you're here now." She said it without sentiment. The plain, declarative way of a woman who had been keeping a business running for 6 years under an absentee title, but there was a warmth in it that Renee felt. She was here now. That was the fact of it. She had arrived where Marcus had been trying to get to by a road he had not been able to finish travelling. She thanked Pearl and went back upstairs to the second-floor apartment, the one with the sticking window. The tenant was not home, and Roy had a key for maintenance purposes, and he let her in and showed her the window. She stood in front of it and looked out at Belmont Avenue below, at the sidewalk, at the specific square of concrete where Marcus had stood for a photograph 17 years ago. She had brought the photograph with her. She took it out and held it up and found the angle in the background, the specific line of the windowsills visible over Marcus's shoulder, and she understood that this was the window he had been standing below. He had come inside. He had stood in this room and looked out at the street and seen himself, briefly, looking back up. She set the photograph on the sill. She put her hands on the sash and lifted, and the window that had been sticking since last fall opened without resistance, as if it had simply been waiting for someone to know to try. The air came in cold and clean, and she stood there with her eyes closed and let it. She drove home that evening as the light was going down behind the hills, the sky at the edge of the horizon, the particular deep blue of early spring evenings, the colour that is almost winter, but has already decided not to be. She let the radio play something she did not recognise and did not feel the need to change it. She thought about roads and the people who drive them not knowing where they will eventually lead. She thought about Marcus at 25, driving this same stretch of highway with a name on a piece of paper and an address and a question that had no answer yet. She thought about what it takes to drive toward the unknown thing, the unmapped thing, the thing that might break your heart or might give you something you did not know how to hope for. She thought about a letter that began with "My name is Marcus Duval," and she thought that most people would not have written it. Most people would have let the blank space where a father was supposed to be remain a blank space, because reaching into a blank space and finding nothing hurts more than leaving it alone. Marcus had reached in anyway. He had written the letter and driven the road and stood on the sidewalk and gone inside, and then he had come home and locked the evidence of all that reaching in a drawer and gone on being a husband and a father, and a man who showed up for his family without making the showing up feel like a sacrifice. He had not had time to see what came back. He had sent the letter and waited, and the man had died, and the attorney had written, and Marcus had locked the door, and then, 2 years later, the largest heart attack his doctor had ever seen in a man under 45 had arrived on a Tuesday in February, and that was that. The not seeing was not giving up, and it was not failure. It was simply the way time works, indifferent to what you have earned and what you are still waiting to receive. She had come back. She had arrived. She had been here. She thought about what inheritance actually is, not just property and money, though there was both. The specific weight of someone else's unfinished reaching passed into your hands at the moment they ran out of time. She had inherited a building, and she had inherited a question, and she had inherited the particular obligation that comes when someone who loved you left something behind that only you can complete. She felt the weight of it, and it was not a burden. It was the opposite of a burden. It was a reason. She had come back with her daughter in the back seat, and her sister driving and a folder of documents on her lap, and she had stood on the sidewalk and crossed the street and walked through the door of a building that had been waiting for someone to walk through it for 11 years, and the thing that had been waiting on the other side was not a fortune, though there was one, and was not a building, though there was one of those too. What was waiting was simpler and older. It was the fact of a man who had tried. It was the record of an attempt. It was a letter in a locked drawer saying he was here, he tried to reach you, he did not run out of courage, he ran out of time. She took the exit for Cincinnati and felt the familiar landscape of home rearranging itself around the car. Bet was still up when she got in, sitting at the kitchen table with her homework fanned out in the circle of the overhead light. She looked up when her mother came through the door and did not ask how it went. She looked at Renee's face and nodded. Once the slow, certain nod of someone who can see what they need to see. Renee hung up her coat. She put her keys on the hook, the car key, and now the key from the drawer which she had taken to carrying with her, less as a practical measure and more as a kind of daily acknowledgement of what it had opened. She sat across from her daughter at the kitchen table and did not say anything for a while. Bet turned back to her homework. The kitchen was warm. The refrigerator made its grinding noise in the corner, and Renee made a note to herself to call someone about it in the morning, because there was no reason left to put it off. She thought about Cora finishing her nursing program, about watching her walk across a stage. She thought about the second-floor apartment on Belmont Avenue and the window that opened easily when you knew to lift it. She thought about a plumber who could give her a real number on the boiler. She thought about her mother's knees and a house that did not have to be rented. She thought about all the things that were possible now that had not been possible 6 months ago, and she held them quietly, not grasping, not spending, just holding. On the nightstand in the bedroom, the photograph of Marcus stood propped against the lamp, and beside it, the brass key lay where she had set it. She had kept her word for 11 years. The keeping had cost her nothing she was not willing to pay, and it had brought her to a morning when a drawer opened and an envelope appeared with her name on it, in the handwriting of a man who had loved her carefully and held the hard things alone, and not had time to finish what he started. She had finished it. She had driven the road he had driven and walked through the door and stood at the window and opened it. And the city on the other side was not foreign anymore. It was hers. It had been hers from the moment a man she had loved put a key in an envelope and wrote her name on the front. Some things do not get lost when they are locked away. Some things wait. Some things accumulate quietly in the dark, like rent faithfully paid, like interest on a balance that no one is drawing down, like grace held in the body of a building by people who did not know whose it was but kept it anyway, because it mattered to someone, even if neither of them knew yet who that someone would turn out to be. She thought about Pearl closing up the print shop at the end of the day, counting the drawer, making the deposit, all the ordinary faithful rhythms of a woman running a business in a building whose story she did not know and had never been told. She thought about Roy with his maintenance log and his reliable plumber, and his 2-minute phone calls when something needed attention. They had kept something whole without knowing what they were keeping. They had held it in trust, and the trust had come due, and here she was on the other side of it. The refrigerator stopped its noise. The kitchen was quiet. Betty turned a page. Have you ever found something that changed your understanding of someone you thought you knew completely? Leave a comment and tell us. And if this story stayed with you, there is another one just like it waiting on this channel, because stories like this one do not run out. The key on the nightstand caught a small light from somewhere, the way brass does, and for a moment it glowed. Renee left it there. It had waited long enough. It was not going anywhere now.